To make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee, one clover and a bee, and reverie. The reverie alone will do if bees are few. To Make a Prairie by Emily Dickinson.
Welcome to Bees and Revery Radio with Emily Wayland and me, LaDawna Howard, where we're going to talk about native plants, pollinator gardening, habitat creation, and other topics related to biodiversity in our backyards and across the country, and what you can do on an individual basis that makes a difference. But Emily, first, who are you?
My name is Emily, and I'm from South Central Wisconsin here in the Midwestern United States. I'm a marketing and creative professional by day, but one of my main hobbies is gardening with native plants in order to create habitat for wildlife. And I also love to educate about monarch butterflies, which I've been rearing as an adult since 2017. And I've been doing so in tandem with citizen science projects such as the tagging program through Monarch Watch. I've been sharing my endeavors with this on TikTok since 2022. And in 2024, I actually got certified as a pollinator steward through the Pollinator Partnership.
You mentioned TikTok, and Emily, that's where you and I met. I'm LaDawna Howard, though some of the people listening may know me from TikTok as Donna Likes Plants. I live in Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C., and over the last few years, I've been transforming my own yard from just plain turf grass into a native plant and pollinator habitat. Now, my yard is just a regular sized yard, but I've been sharing that journey and what I've learned from it on TikTok and social media. And Emily, I'm so excited to get to work with you on this project because you're an incredible source of knowledge and inspiration. I know we wanted a platform where we can talk a little more in depth and dig into some of those questions. Emily, one thing I love about your TikTok account is the work that you do with monarchs. And I know we're going to do a whole episode on the federal proposal around monarchs really soon. But one thing I'm curious about is why you raise monarchs. See, I see monarchs in my own yard on milkweed and other plants, but I never thought about raising them. How'd you get into that? Why do you do that?
Sure. So I actually did this as a kid with my dad. And then, I went to college for a while and didn't do it. But as an adult, I was actually walking my dog one day and saw a monarch egg on a milkweed along the bike path where we used to live in Madison, Wisconsin. And it was just a time where I was just like, maybe I'll try doing this again. So it really kind of began as like a nostalgia experiment, so to speak. But then I learned more about their plight and how they have an 80 to 90% decline in population since the late 80s and 90s. So it kind of began as my efforts to try to save them. But the more I did this, the more I realized that the benefit to raising is education. The number one way to help them is by planting their native host plant milkweed. So I really try to do it as an educational thing. And I really try to make sure the work I do with them is about quality and not quantity. I only raise the monarchs that I find in my yard and on locations that are being developed or are at risk of being mowed.
Mm.
Um, so I really do it to teach others about them. They are a very beloved and iconic insect to so many people. And when I teach people about them, they realize that they are in danger of being possibly endangered or extinct in the future, people want to help. And they can do that by planting milkweed. But if they also want to get closer to nature and pass the message along, I encourage them to do that.
Oh, I love that. And I've seen you on your TikTok account where you know, where you'll find a monarch on a plant in an area that isn't safe for it. Like as you said, it's an area that's being developed or something, and bring it home.
Correct. One of the places I go to nearby in my town actually is a lot that's for sale, and who knows if it'll be sold. It's actually owned by a car dealership, and they frequently mow it to put extra cars on or do car shows. So I just make sure that I get all the monarchs I can off that milkweed before they mow it, and those lives are saved.
Oh, I love that. I don't know if I will start raising monarchs myself. I love that you do that, and I love that people do it. In my yard, I do create pollinator habitat, and I see monarchs. I see adult monarchs on a lot of the nectar plants in my yard. I've seen monarch caterpillars on the milkweed, and sometimes I wonder, like, should I, should I bring that monarch caterpillar inside? But I have just been amazed at the difference that 1 yard makes. I will confess that when I started doing this in my own yard a few years ago, I didn't think it would make that big of a difference. And just in the few years that I have been transforming my yard into native plants and pollinator plants, seeing the bees and the butterflies and the birds and ladybugs, all the beneficial bugs. It blows me away how much of a difference 1 yard can really make.
So tell me about your yard. How big is it? When did you get started doing this? What did you plant?
I started it a few years ago. My yard is just, I call it sort of a normal suburban sized yard. I live in more of an urban kind of area. I live within walking distance of a subway stop. There's condos right across the street from me. The houses here are pretty close together. A block away there are restaurants and things like that. So it's somewhere kind of between an urban and a suburban kind of area, which is another reason why I was surprised at the difference that I've seen just in my yard. And my neighbors have commented on that too. Neighbors have said, "Wow, so many birds, so many butterflies, so many bees in your yard." What seems to us like not a very big plot of land, it really helps with biodiversity. I guess it's a big plot of land to a bee or to a butterfly.
Well, and we need to remember too that 85% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So every tiny acre or pocket of land does matter to them.
Mm. And in my yard, I have a combination in my yard of native plants. I've looked up plants that are native where I am, and I know we're going to talk a lot about that in this season
Oh,
of our
yeah.
podcast, really focused on native plants, pollinator gardens, how to find out what's native where you are and how to get started. Learn from my mistakes. I have native plants. I have pollinator patches. I also do grow some food. I have a couple of raised beds, and I grow food and herbs and some pollinator plants in containers on my patio as well. I look forward in this season of our podcast being able to talk about all of that. But Emily, you're not in as urban of an area as I am. What about your yard?
Right. So I actually used to live in a more urban area. I used to rent in Madison, Wisconsin. But a few years ago in 2021, my husband and I bought a house in a more rural area of South Central Wisconsin. So I went from having barely a yard, like I was lucky to have like a small scrap of turf grass that I could do some gardening in, and I did, to almost a half acre now. So I am actually doing, I feel like this garden is pretty small, but I am actually trying to do a combination of like some more designed pollinator gardens around the property as landscaping, but also I started doing a just prairie. It is a mix of
Mm.
native plants, both host and nectaring wildflowers with a bloom cycle from spring to fall so it can feed everything, as well as like native grasses, sticks, and nesting materials, that I can just let part of my yard be wild. So it's been nice being able to spread out from a more limiting environment in the past.
I love it. Now, you mentioned that you're letting part of your yard just go wild. I am doing the same thing. I have a corner of my yard that I call it the area that we just let it go. Now, when we bought our house a few years ago, there were some invasive species in our backyard that we had to take out, and there's a corner of the yard that I just then, when we pulled out those invasive species, then it was a big mud hole. And instead of putting turf grass down, I put down seeds of native wildflowers. And that's the area where I have seen a lot of bees, butterflies, ladybugs, all sorts of native insects and beneficial bugs. And I know that that's a really important part, is having an area that really you're able to leave undisturbed. But Emily, the question I get a lot on social media when people see that part of my yard is they say, "How are you able to do this?" Because people are saying that where they live, something like that would be illegal. Um,
Right.
and you have a part of your yard that's wild. So I'll talk about where I live, but where you live, are you allowed to do what you're doing with the part of your yard that you let grow wild?
Right. So I'm not an HOA, so I am allowed. But what I'm what there are some towns that require you to have a natural yard permit. I am trying to do it slowly and in such a way that it goes with the yard, and I can just slowly add it to where I don't need to get into filling out the paperwork and doing that part of the bureaucracy. It is kind of wild to me that municipalities will charge you for having $50 for a permit to have a more natural lawn. And they have, like, I looked up one in a town a few years ago where it was like, tell me about your pest management problem, but they don't specify what pests they're talking about. And they want you to draw the plans and stuff like that. But for right now, I am just slowly adding it to one part of the yard and kind of making it, like a grass path going through it. So it goes with the yard, but it's not a complete like nature preserve, so to speak, if
Mm-hmm.
that makes any sense. And having the designed beds in addition to that, but still with native plants, I'm hoping will my neighbors will not be bothered by that. So we'll see what happens, but that is just where I'm at with it.
And Emily, I think we could do a whole episode on this topic, on kind of how to do this in a yard,
Oh yeah.
depending on what's legal where you live. Now, I'm lucky because where I live in a county in Maryland that actually promotes native planting. We are
Oh,
allowed, there's no height limit on our plants. I know that in a lot of parts of the country, one of the big deals is there are height limits on how
yes,
long your
correct.
grasses and your plants can be. There's no height limit on ours as long as they are native. Um, they can't go right up to the edge of the property where I am. There are some other counties here where you can go all the way up to the edge of the property. You can't go all the way up to the edge of the property. We have to have a little buffer around the
Sure.
edge of the property. As long as they're native, we can get away with that. But I know there are parts of the country, there are folks who may live in an HOA or they may live in a city or county that has really strict regulations on what they can grow in their yard. Some of them have really strict height requirements. Emily, I loved what you said about having your flower beds. That's how I started too. Even though I can get away with what I'm doing legally where I am, I'm the only person in my neighborhood, in my immediate environment, that's doing it. And so I didn't want to piss off all my neighbors, by being the only one that has tall grass and really tall, really tall flowers and flowers that, even though the flowers are native where I am, they're a little bit unusual, right? People are used to seeing all the same kind of flowers like roses.
Hydrangeas.
Right, right. People aren't really used to seeing a lot of native flowers and they can look a little bit weedy, right? If you don't know what they are. And so I have a lot of mine in a flower bed as well, where we mow around the edges of the flower bed. But anyway, that's just one of the biggest things I hear on my social media accounts when people see my yard. A lot of people say, "Oh, you're so lucky you can do that. I could never get away with that." So I've learned from people online about a lot of different ways that you can get away with it or get away with it a little bit, even if you live in an HOA. So we'll dedicate a whole episode to that because I think that's a big issue on people's minds.
Oh yeah, and just to add to your point, that's another reason why I rear the monarchs in general, because more people need to be planting native plants. You're talking about the you being the only person in your neighborhood. Well, that should probably change. So when people learn about insects like the monarch or rusty patch bumblebee being in trouble and they want to help, that might encourage them to actually participate and just leave the norms of the hydrangeas and rose bushes behind, but actually plant some native plants.
Yes, and I'm working on my neighbors too. I think I'm making some inroads.
That's excellent to hear. We'll keep working on this. So perhaps we should talk about more why we're here.
Yeah, what
Is
are we
that
going to do? Yeah, what are we going to do with this podcast? We met on TikTok because we have similar things that we talk about.
right? So I just kind of reached out to you, seeing if you wanted to do this, and you were game. So here we are.
Yeah, I think, what you and I both are thinking is that it would be great to have a place where we can talk a little more in depth. I love TikTok. I've been on TikTok for about 2.5 years now, and I like the ability to show video. I like the short form content. I like the engagement and the back and forth there. TikTok is is a place where it's easy to, answer questions and that type of thing. But there is a limit to how kind of deep you can go. TikTok is not really the best place for nuance or
No,
for
not.
going, for going really in depth. And so I'm really looking forward to, we can dig in here to some of the most common questions that we get about what we're doing, share what we've learned, share tips for other folks on how to get started in their own backyard, and, what they can do to make a difference.
Yes, I'm really excited to start this project and see where it goes. Our podcast seasons, we're planning about doing about 6 to 10 episodes per season, 1 episode per week, and we will take time off in between seasons to prepare for the next one.
What Emily and I have talked about is focusing this season 1 on some of what we've been talking about here: native plants, why they're important, how we can create this kind of habitat that promotes biodiversity in our own backyards, finding out what plants are native where you live, everything that kind of goes into making a garden that supports pollinators and other wildlife. And it's a lot of fun.
And this podcast is all about how we can each make a difference for the environment, for biodiversity, and every one of us can make a difference. And it really does matter. We need to remember that we are all a part of nature. To me, nature isn't just a place where we recreate to, like a state or national park. It is outside our very front door, and the environment is our home. So, with the advent of technology and TikTok and social media and all that kind of stuff, I feel like humanity has become somewhat distanced and like separated from it. Here we are in an effort to bring you all back to Mother Nature and reconnecting with it.
I love that. So tune in here for season 1 of Bees and Reverie Radio podcast. And in the meantime, you can follow us on social media so you'll know exactly when episodes will drop, where you can listen to them, and maybe some behind the scenes content as well. We are at Bees and Reverie Radio on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky.
So thanks for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us in planting native and taking better care of the world in which we live.
All right. See you next time.